Welcome to the Conjecture Institute podcast for part 2 of my conversation with mathematician Paul Raymond-Robichaud. Today's episode is the Q&A from the audience for that part of our conversation where we have taken questions from X. And this right here, right now, is me apologising for the sound in this episode, in parts of the recording. There were some connection issues. I'm in Australia, Paul's in Canada. It's about as far apart as you can possibly be on the globe, on planet Earth. And so we did have some losses, which I found I was unable to recover. Nonetheless, 99% is there in terms of the substance, and I don't think it really gets in the way of listening to Paul's insightful and very interesting answers. So with that said, on with the episode. Okay, so moving on to the questions. If you can see, we've got one there from Hugo Graw, and it's a question in multiple parts. And Hugo has asked that he would love to hear more about your background, where you grew up, how you got interested in mathematics, intellectual inspirations, and what you think the future of mathematics looks like in the light of AI. Also, how you integrate AI into your workflows.
So my background, which I answered in the previous part, I am a mathematician who later developed an interest in foundation of mathematics, then in computer science in order to understand the foundation of mathematics, and then finally in physical physics and foundation of physics, especially quantum theory, for the goal of understanding both the aspect of computing and aspect related to the foundation of mathematics itself, and also understanding how reality itself is structured. And where I grew up in the South Shore of Montreal. I am a French Canadian. That explains my very funny accent and my name that is hard to pronounce for everyone else. How I got interested in mathematics, I don't recall, because for as long as I remember, even as a small child, I was really into mathematics. There's plenty of things that you can show even a small child that are not too complicated and are really funny or interesting. For instance, I remember learning about Eulerian graphs as a kid, and it's just a funny thing that you can draw a graph and try to find out if there's a path that go from all that traverse all edges and come back to the same place, and then you learn that the answer is that's possible if each vertices has degree that is even, and that's something that as a child you can amuse yourself to. I didn't learn the theorem itself why it's true, but I learned that it's true, and I tried with many such graphs, and I remember really liking to play with all these kinds of ideas. Or at some point, I learned how the ancient Greek would relate the area of circumference of circle with its area formula. And that's something with little triangles. It's not too complicated. You just need to know what's the area of a triangle to get it. I think children can become very interested in math, and there's plenty of ideas that we don't show them because we're so interested in showing them very boring methods. And so that's how I got interested, by seeing ideas that I really enjoyed and was able to learn about them as a kid. My intellectual inspirations, that's complicated because I don't really believe you need a role model to enjoy mathematics. And we live in an era where a lot of academics seem to think that you need a role model that is your exact, sometimes even your ethnicity or your exact gender or your exact copy. But what happens if you're the first? Does it mean that you're unable to do anything? Of course not. You're still able to develop ideas, and what you need is not necessarily a role model or an intellectual inspiration. You just need the desire to mathematics, or just, and that's enough. You don't need more. You're already universal. You're already capable enough. And now, what does the future looks like in the light of AI? Fundamentally, the future is unpredictable for mathematics. But what I can imagine is that there's really just two types of AI: the weak AI and the strong AI that is general. And they're both incredibly different. If AI, as long as there's no strong AI, I'll take the question as such. As long as there's no strong AI for mathematics, what it means is that it's going to get increasingly better at tasks that belong to the closure of humanity's knowledge in mathematics. Any kind of task where a method is discovered, and an extremely abstract method that can become more and more generalized, the computer will be able to do it. But that's great because the amount of mathematics that we'll need to do mathematics is really infinite in scope. As that closure increase, as the knowledge increase, there's going to be more and more problems that we'll need to tackle creatively. And that's For me, AI in mathematics has been incredibly useful. The way I use it is often to explain old ideas. I really struggle to have it do anything new because often it's not really able to do anything at the moment, except if I'm able to translate it in an old language using old ideas. And even then, I need to decompose it into ideas that might have been tackled before, and that's not. I think people maybe afraid they've heard AI has been able to get a gold medal in mathematics Olympics, but these are all prompts where people that are created so that a large amount of people can do them with a certain subset of methods, and that these methods can be taught in camps. Of course, they require to guess the solution, to be, for humans, they certainly require creativity to be able to be tackled, but they're very different from even basics prompts that I ask myself, because the big difference is the basic question I ask myself might not exist anywhere else. So I need to do it from scratch, and the AI is not too good for that. How I integrate AI in my workflow. These days, if I want to learn something old, I almost always ask the AI to help me. I also use AI to help writing like normal people that are not or non-mathematician. I use AI to help me compose text that need to be reviewed, drafted, or anything like that. But for mathematics, it's mostly to be able to explain stuff, or if it's very basic, I might ask it to try to guess a solution for a problem, but it has to be basic at this point.
Yeah, one of the most amazing things about present AI is that you ask it for an explanation for something you don't yet understand. I found this myself in physics and mathematics, for example. And if you don't understand the response that it gives you initially, you just keep on asking it and never gets bored. It doesn't get angry, and it gives you more and more clear answers. And so you can use it as like an almost an ideal kind of tutor in a sense. I really enjoy that part out of ChatGPT.
But sometimes it can be wrong, and that's why you need to think always. But that's the case for a human too. When people say the I can be wrong, the answer is so can humans.
So the question is about inspiration. So you have a particular take on inspiration as opposed to, let's say, thanking people, which I think maybe the intention of the original question was they wanted to know who the inspiring people were, but you've got a different take.
That's true. The thing is, I'm inspired more by ideas than by people, because I think people have a lot of ideas, some of which might help you to accomplish what you want to accomplish, some do not. So we should never aim to be a perfect copy of any of our predecessors. And it's always more specific. I'm always inspired by ideas, not people, but I'm thankful to people, not ideas. I would like to thank people that in the past have been very helpful to me and whose ideas inspired me a lot. And I will name them. First, there was Gert Sabidussi. He's the math professor who, when I started university in mathematics, took me under his wing, and I went to visit him every single week since the very start of my bachelor degree. And with him, we did real mathematics, not following recipe or any kind of boring memorizations, or just viewing proof. Proof were much more explanatory. We discussed them. There was a place for originality and creativity and discussion and trying to find the deep ideas that are within proof. And with them also, I was doing algebraic graph theory, but I saw that mathematics truly had no boundaries, because if you wanted to solve a problem in graph theory, you might need ideas from group theory, from even foundations of mathematics like set theory. I recall a theorem about graph theory whose truth depends on which axioms of set theory we were working within, and some ideas came from analysis or even topology, or and all I could see, even while studying something supposedly narrow, algebraic graph theory, was a deep interconnected web that truly required a breadth of knowledge and an ability to view things across all fields. We would discuss category theory, any single thing necessary to understand. Nothing was off limit, and also I had many interesting conversations. When I met him, I think he was 77 years old, and he was born in Vienna in the year 1930s. And in his long life, he had viewed many things that I was curious about. One of my favorite story was about the crisis and foundation of mathematics. And when he was 25 years old, he was at Princeton, and he had met many of the characters that shaped history. He had seen Gödel, he had seen a lot of great mathematicians. He even had a friendship with Albert Einstein at some point when he was at the Princeton Institute. So I was very curious about all these things, and we discussed them, and we discussed a bit of his life. And I was very thankful to be able to share a piece of this history, because there were not many people today who could have told me the story in a direct way, who had seen direct things like that. But at some point, after starting a PhD with him in graph theory, I was more and more attracted to the foundations of mathematics. And that's when I turned to Gilles Brassard, with whom I had my first course in my first advanced course, because I had another course in uh, the theory of computation, but the best course I had on the theory of computation, and I really adored it, and I wanted to do something more foundational, and he did a lot of things for me. I did my PhD under him, and he was always there to listen to me, to whether it was for something personal or for something related to my ideas. He was always willing to listen and always supporting all of the ideas that I had, and he did a lot of things. I cannot even enumerate all of them, but it was tough letters of recommendations or promoting my ideas. For the last years since he's known me, one of the most important, most of his conferences, when they're about quantum foundations, or they're always about my ideas, and he's always promoting them with great enthusiasm. One thing is, he's a famous scientist. I'm not, and when you're famous, you get invited, but you get to choose which ideas to present, and he presented mine. So for me, that's amazing. I like when someone else has the chance to promote my ideas, and he chose of his to do that, and I'm extremely grateful and thankful that he did all these things. And I really cannot name everything he's done, because then I would need an hour, and then maybe it would not be complete. So I'm just going to, but he also, yeah, introduced me to ideas in computer science, and at an intellectual level, there were many such ideas on computations, and he's one of the inventor of a lot of, or co-inventor of a lot of deep ideas in quantum information theory. I think with David, he won the Breakthrough Prize in Physics, along with, I think it's Peter Shor and Charles Bennett. He did a lot of discovery on his own, and that shaped the field of quantum information as it is today. And then a person I met who the Institute is devoted to is David Deutsch, that I met years ago when I was developing my ideas in quantum foundation and locality. And David is someone with whom I've discussed a lot of ideas in the foundation of physics and the foundation of mathematics, but also ideas that are dear to me on freedom and how to live freely, and on philosophy too. And I think he has the lifestyle the closest to what I want to live, and he was always willing to share these ideas with me, always willing to also explain them in a deep and explanatory way, where the ideas are discussed. We always try to get to the bottom and try to find out even ideas on how to deal with children are dealt in terms of knowledge creation and physics. And I think that's wonderful, because these are the arguments that have the most reach, that you can use to all areas. And he did also things behind the scene for which I'm thankful. Yeah, so it was great to know David. And finally, there is Piotr Wozniak, who's the inventor of the first space repetition algorithm. He introduced me to a few ideas on learning that are similar to those of David. For example, the fact that we should reject a curriculum, that learning should be non-coercive. He is devoted to both space repetition and the fact that the algorithm should not be used in a coercive way to just pass and cram for exam. That's not what humanity requires. And I had many early discussion with him when I started using space repetition, and on the fact that these things, for humanity to be able to go to the next level, whatever learning we do, whatever society we have, we'll have to give a lot more place to freedom.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I have not the same kind of story that you have, but I remember that after reading The Fabric of Reality, because I was one of these students that was very interested in science and mathematics in particular at high school, and I thought of philosophy as being that kind of subject you do if you're not really capable of doing science and mathematics. This is naively what I thought back when I was a high school student. And I read The Fabric of Reality and I thought, oh, maybe there is something to this philosophy thing. And so I decided to take a subject in undergraduate in philosophy, and it was called Reason, Value, and Persons. And it was taught by three different lecturers. And I listened to the lectures about persons and I didn't really understand. Values was morality. But then it got to reason, which was all about logic. And there was this lecturer, and his name was Michaelis Michael at the University of New South Wales. And he was very undisciplined. He didn't follow the curriculum. He used to get sidetracked all the time and he'd answer people's questions. And this is exactly what most of the students didn't like. They wanted to have a kind of rigorous sort of curriculum. But I was really happy with this. I thought, this is fantastic. This is the way that lecturing should be done. Just go in the direction that the students want to take you. And it was the most exciting thing for me. And I would choose subjects based on whether or not he was teaching the particular thing. And I think many people, all they need is one person like that. And that one person, even though eventually as I matured to my understanding of epistemology and morality and David Deutsch's worldview, Karl Popper's worldview, I realized that my opinion of philosophy and everything diverged from my favorite lecturer very much, very starkly. And we disagreed about almost everything when it came to the philosophy of science. But I still found that I was so grateful for the fact that he had this style of teaching and interacting with students that made me encounter things I probably wouldn't have read otherwise and I wouldn't have been interested in because I disagreed with them so markedly. But it was important for me to understand these arguments. Stuff from Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example. I had to read heaps and heaps of it, and stuff from Saul Kripke and David Lewis and people who I eventually disagreed with. But I thought I probably wouldn't have been so interested to tackle these ideas if the lecturer himself wasn't providing them in a sort of fun, friendly, and as approximately non-coercive way as is possible in a standard university course. So yeah, you need a special mentor at times, I think. Something like a mentor, someone who's going to be friendly to you anyway.
You need friends, that's for sure. And even today, I think friends are great. You can discuss with them, and I think in the future, we can't take away the community for learning and the ability to interact with people. But it might evolve the way it's done. For instance, I discovered with X.com, formerly known as Twitter, a few months ago. And I think it's great because we can do learning in public. And I think that's a bit of what you do. That in the past, you could only talk to 5 or maybe 30 people if you're a teacher. But now you can at least discuss all your ideas with everyone and answer to their question. And yeah.
Many people think that ability in mathematics is a proxy for IQ, that the better you are at mathematics, then the better your brain works. And so therefore, the more employable you are, even if the job that you're going to get may have no requirements to understand anything from algebra through to calculus. But people do have this idea that perhaps in the corporate world, there might be a job that they're going for, and unless their mathematics examination results are really high, then we can eliminate them from the selection pool because they're not going to be very good thinkers or they're not going to be very good learners, because you can see it on their test results there. They didn't do well on the maths test. What do you think about this way of thinking about people?
It might very well that math test something that can be applied to the corporate world in the following sense. It represents the ability to do something that you might not want to do and to pursue it. And maybe that is what the corporate world is trying to select for people that do things that are unenjoyable and do so conscientiously and without asking any kind of question. If I think math test is an excellent proxy for the ability to navigate the corporate world or the academic world. However, if math tests themselves measure a very narrow subset of knowledge, one that is not very creative. And to be good at math, you need knowledge about math and you need interest about math, none of which are forbidden to anyone. I've never encountered, and it's very knowledge dependent. The ability to do any kind of mathematics depend on your knowledge. With it, some problems become incredibly easy. Without it, some problems become incredibly hard. And knowledge of things like algebraic theory or topology doesn't translate to the ability to understand world history. For instance, it's a topic I still are completely incompetent at, that I don't know much about. So the ability to do things for a human is very dependent on knowledge and ideas can be acquired. And
I was just going to say that you and I accept this, and I think many people who are within the orbit of the Conjecture Institute would also accept this vision of people as being able to learn everything and they need the problem. But it's still an extreme minority view. The overwhelming majority of people out there will say something like the following. And I think Jordan Peterson is a case in point. He will often point to the fact that IQ tests are predictive of a person's success throughout society. And as I say, mathematics scores are predictive of, let's say, someone's level of income. And more than that, not only are they predictive of your own individual success throughout life, let's say, but it's also heritable. So you are going to have genes for the ability to do mathematics or not, that this is a kind of thing that is baked into your nature. And there's going to be a maximum amount that you can learn in mathematics, and that is determined by what your parents have gifted you in terms of genes. I know what we think about this, but how would you articulate a response to that kind of worldview, which is just, it is the dominant worldview at the moment?
First, that once you remove coercion for learning, a kid can really learn anything. The dominating factor is when you see a new piece of information is, do I have enough information or understanding to understand it at this moment? If I don't, I can merely go to other source that explain the knowledge I missed. And the way knowledge is structured is never really complicated. But it's true that IQ tests have predictive value in a fixed environment that include coercion. And it might well be that there's plenty of factors. For instance, some children like to get up and walk a lot, and the classroom doesn't allow this. And maybe the more society is constrained, the more these tests might have value to predict things, but they only test in a situation that is very coercive. It doesn't include the most important factor. When you have high freedom and high creativity, I don't have a problem to say that even things like your height or how much you eat might have some influence on what you can do in a society that is quite coercive, doesn't allow creativity, doesn't allow solving problems, doesn't allow overcoming these limits. But the real question is, are we evolving toward that? Are we evolving toward a society full of these constraints, or one that remove all these boundaries? For instance, sometimes you might need a certain speed to process a problem, but in freedom, whether it takes you 20% longer or 20% shorter, it doesn't really matter from the fundamental point of view of creativity. Or you start lacking a bit of memory. In these tests, generally, you cannot have access to paper or things like that. But if you add papers, you become equal to the person who had a bit more processing power. If you consider universality and the ability to change your environment, the ability to access internet, the ability to do all these things, whatever difference there were, become closer and closer to zero. And at some point, once we can truly change our brain or things like that, all these things like genetics become less and less relevant.
Yeah, and the psychologists will often say things like, and they may very well admit their own field suffers from, let's say, a replication crisis. However, that one narrow field of the cognitive science when it comes to IQ tests is highly replicable. You can repeat these same tests over and again and people get the same results over and again, and somehow they point to this as being scientific in some way. Of course, it completely ignores the fact that science isn't about predictions after all. It's about explanations as to why a person is able to perform well on these tests. And anyone who takes an IQ test, or even a mathematics test for that matter, knows that all one needs to do is to practice the test if you want to perform well on the test. This is one of the ways in which, just as a side issue, they try to, for example, suggest that to improve teachers, what they should do is to pay a teacher based upon their performance. Now, how do you pay a teacher based on their performance? It's based on how well a child does in the tests. But if you're a teacher being paid for your performance according to how well the children in your class do on a standardized test, all you do is you just make them do many practice tests. And of course, their test scores will go up from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. This idea of replicability, or the ability to repeat the same thing and get the same results, is not the hallmark of a scientific study. And it's not the hallmark in particular of being creative. And in the more and more modern an economy and civilization becomes, the less and less repetition there will be. There will less and less stuff there will be to do that is laborious. Because as David Deutsch likes to say, anything that can be automated should be automated, freeing up the person to do the creative work. And that in the future is what industry should be looking for. And there won't be a standardized test or an IQ test that is going to be able to tell you how creative someone will be. Because in one very deep sense, we are all equally creative in the sense that we can all have any idea that anyone else can have and any idea that's possible, which is literally any physical process that's out there that can happen. We can have an idea about that, usually false, but hey, we can make progress in that way.
That's true, but I also want to add that in mathematics, the kind of problem we need to solve are never from on the test. If a problem has been solved and isn't a test, it's already something that will not improve the knowledge of humanity to solve it again, except if you do something creative with it, which won't be included in whatever the test is testing. So the kind of problems that a real mathematician has to solve are generally creative, deep, cannot be solved in 5 minutes, might need a few years to be solved, and don't have any kind of metric because you can't really evaluate the value of knowledge. There's no metric for it, and there's absolutely no way to test it. But you mentioned everyone is equal creatively. That's true, but some ideas are still better than others, and acquiring these boring ideas that allow to pass tests are some of the worst ideas to acquire if we want to become creative. Not in the sense of changing our universality, because we can't, but in the sense of acquiring better ideas that lead to better knowledge. It requires still a good philosophy, and philosophies are not equal. Some philosophies are inimical to creativity, prevent the generation of good ideas.
Yes, I was going to say that as well. There's two senses in which, okay, so on the one hand, everyone is equally universal, so there's that kind of creativity. But on the other, we have two ways in which a person might affect their own creativity. One is where they become enculturated with anti-rational memes, as you say, the active suppression of creativity because of anti-critical ideas that a person takes on. But there's also this other idea, and David Deutsch wrote about this, and I just did this podcast with Liberty Fitzclarridge about how In Praise of Ignorance, it was called, and this idea that certain knowledge that you can gain can just change the way in which you are able to think about things. Maybe not in a complete way. There must be some way you can get over the hump. But take, for example, one area that I'm interested in, which is the way in which physics is taught. All undergraduate physics courses begin basically the same way. They all begin with classical mechanics. They all go through Newtonian physics, and they teach you all the classical stuff. In other words, they teach you all the stuff we already know is false and has been superseded. Now, some people might want to know that. Engineers might very well need to know that kind of thing in order to do their job. But if your ambition, let's say, is to be a theoretical physicist, then trying to build on Newton is not the way to go. Although that said, there are some people out there who do try and build on Newton still. Okay, so putting that to one side, the issue here is maybe simply learning the way in which Newton and Laplace and various other people did classical mechanics could actually affect your mind in such a way that when you decide to try to improve on quantum theory or on relativity, which are different to both of those kind of ways in which to think about the world, there's your mind automatically goes to a place where they say, that can't possibly be true because I've already learnt this other thing, even though that other thing is false. So you've got these ideas in your mind where what you're interested in is creating new ideas, the ballast of the old idea can sometimes encumber you. Might not be forever, but it could slow you down, let's say, in trying to get to your solution because you're just always you're always criticizing your own creative thoughts.
Seems utter bad ideas have to be included because as a mathematician, I often study theories that are incompatible in the sense that Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries cannot be part of the same model. Some of the ideas cannot be. And yet, for a mathematician who's been taught that all that matter when you study a model is more its ability to solve problems for other theories and its consistency and other traits like that, it doesn't really cause any kind of problem for me to study a lot of theories that cannot be fully compatible. I think there might be a hang up somewhere that classical mechanics is the truth or is the way things go, which is additional to the theory of classical mechanics. And however, studying things that don't help to solve your problems, as you said, when you do physics, starting with classical mechanics when there's absolutely no need to this, is a hindrance for humanity because it's time wasted. So all these curriculum that start in exactly the same way and is exactly the same for all people is horrible for this because what we need is 7 billion people interested in 7 billion different type of ideas, the one that they are the most suited for to solve themselves. And anytime we reduce humanity to a certain set of ideas, we reduce ideas. So I'm just going to give a few examples that I know of. When Gilles Brassard invented BB84 with Charles Bennett, it was completely new ideas on how cryptography worked that would mix ideas from physics and ideas in cryptography. All knew nothing about physics, but Charles Bennett, who we met, did, and start meeting very randomly at the beach, and a guy, Charles Bennett, starts swimming toward him and start telling him ideas about quantum theory. And at the end of the conversation, they invent a protocol of cryptography that doesn't exist at school. And that's the kind of thing that curriculum would completely hinder. And in my own story, as you can see, I've not followed a very prescribed path. Not many people go into quantum theory after first going through years of ordinary mathematics without any interest in quantum theory, then years of computer science, then physics. And I don't know anything about classical theory, don't care about it. My knowledge of physics is not has not been wasted on theories I don't care about. And the way to reach that is simply freedom. The way to remove the curriculum and all its hindrance is just to let people be free. And that's incredibly simple as an idea, but to get there might still take years for us.
Yes. Now, next question is from Thibault, who is a great fan of the critical rationalist community, and he is very active out there on Twitter. And he has asked the question, quote, people like Charlie Munger advocate for multidisciplinary thinking and learning the big ideas in many fields. What are the big ideas in mathematics? The ones that carry 80% of the freight for a regular person or any other field that he knows well. For example, I'm very glad I learned reductio ad absurdum in maths because I can use it for many other things in life.
That's a great question. And I recall when I started learning mathematics at the advanced level, at the university level, I realized often that some idea would recur over and over. And I noticed that the subdivision of mathematics into fields is really an error because often to solve a problem in one field, so I started a PhD in graph theory before switching to my PhD in quantum computing. And when I was doing the PhD in graph theory, I learned quickly that all fields of mathematics were interrelated and that often if you knew basics in all kind of branches of mathematics, it would influence your ability to solve problems in graph theory. What are the big ideas in mathematics? I would say they are the basics in all fields of mathematics. I rarely need to use advanced theorems, but I find it very useful to know, at least at an introductory level, many fields of mathematics because the basics in each of the fields, for instance, just knowing what a linear function is extremely useful in graph theory, in group theory, in quantum theory, in all kind of things. And so for me, the big ideas are those that recur in all kind of places, and they're the basics in all the fields, and not just the field you're studying, but really all fields. They all interrelate. So, for instance, in quantum theory, you need knowledge of probability theory, of Hilbert spaces, of group theory. But for what I don't need the most advanced theorems, I just need the basics and to know how they interrelate.
So could you tell me, and this is just me extending on what Thibault has said there, I suppose there's this idea, for example, in physics, that the biggest, most important theories that we have in fundamental physics are general relativity on the one hand and quantum theory or quantum field theory on the other hand. Is there something analogous in mathematics where you have these two or multiple big ideas where there's an attempt to make progress in those areas, perhaps even at the expense of a whole bunch of other things at the moment? What's fashionable?
So I don't know what's fashionable in mathematics because I don't follow fashion, but there are big theories that attempt to view mathematics as a whole. An example would be category theory, but I would not say it's bigger as a branch than other theories. It's just one that give you a bird eye view of everything going on. But there's also kind of meta theories for mathematics. So there's a theories that unify like group theory, ring theory, and that would be more called universal algebra. But even I view mathematics as a collection of theories and they're all interrelated with each other. It's not that these meta theories are viewed as more important. It's different from physics because in physics, you have a reality that act as an arbiter that tells you this is very important to understand to solve our problems. But in mathematics, it's pure knowledge that is developed simply because we want to or find a problem interesting. And what might make a theory more important is that it solves a lot of problems, but I cannot point to a single one that solves all the problems. What I see is an interrelated web of theories.
Yes. Now, we've already spoken about coercion in education generally, and we've talked about how, in particular in mathematics, it's a real problem because it's one of those compulsory subjects at school. But Lou has asked, with respect to this, that TCS, taking children seriously, people are skeptic of claims about the importance of learning any field because they're usually pushed coercively. But can you, Paul, make the case of the importance of voluntarily learning math? And I think maybe I could put a spin on this is I think he might be trying to say, what would be your marketing for mathematics? If you could go out there and just have a lecture for people and just say to them why mathematics is useful or fun or important, what might you say? Why voluntarily pick it up?
I, of course, think that all learning should be voluntary. There should never be an exception to that. I oppose all forms of coercion in learning. As for should people learn math, the answer is it depends what people's interests are. I don't think you should make the case that people should learn math more than any other topic. And that's a big error that I feel is being made. People view math as this thing which is all important, but it's important for some problems. And it's the people themselves that are learning that should be making that decision. I don't think we should even try to influence them on that regard, except if you genuinely think they would enjoy it. The reason that when you're with a friend, you never say, oh, I think you should read this book because this is important knowledge that you require. It's more, I think you should read this book because you would enjoy it. Or you mentioned this problem you're working on, I think this could help you, or something like that. And in as much as you think someone might enjoy math and you're doing it for the other person.
But here is the argument that I hear very often. This is the claim that is made. And what would you say about this? Learning mathematics actively changes your brain in such a way as to make you a clearer thinker. If you're better at mathematics, you will think more logically, you'll think more clearly across all different domains. And so therefore, it is like a keystone subject. It's not learning music. It's not like learning chemistry. It is special in a particular regard, and it will increase your overall IQ. What do you say about that?
So it's very knowledge specific for many things. I don't think that it's going to make you better. It might not even make you a better thinker for generalized things, because knowledge of topology is not going to help outside of fields that do require topology. And as for becoming a better thinker, it is true that mathematics rely on logical arguments and that logic might teach you things, but the logic that mathematicians use tend to be will not teach you how to interpret the arguments or where the non-logical errors are. In terms of being a better thinker, mathematics will not help you for arguments that really rely a lot on the meaning of words that you need to understand. It will not give you the knowledge that is specific to the arguments you are examining. What you need to solve problems is knowledge, and knowledge tend to be very domain specific. And it's true that mathematics has logic, formal logic in that, but the basic rules of logic are much more simpler than the rules that are used by mathematicians. It's because in ordinary life arguments, we don't need to rely on formal rules of logic. We just need to rely on logical thinking, which while it rely on the same rules, they don't need as much precision, and we don't use quantifiers and rules of manipulating quantifiers and things like that because our arguments are generally not as complex. I don't think that mathematics will make you a better thinker. I don't think it's going to increase your IQ. And I think doing these things for that sake rather than the sake of mathematics is counterproductive. If you do need mathematics to solve a problem, then for all means go for it. But I think you should start with a problem, realize you need mathematics, and then use the mathematics rather than simply learn mathematics for the sake of perhaps solving some problem at some point.
There's a lot of pseudoscience in this area as well. I don't know if you're aware of these studies that come out from time to time in cognitive science or brain science, or wouldn't name your subject that's like that, neuroscience, where what they do is they teach a school student how to play a musical instrument, and they notice at times that it is correlated with an increase in their math scores. So the argument there is coerce the student to learn musical instruments because coercing them to learn mathematics alone isn't enough. So we can do both of these kinds of coercion and they help one another. I just think it's all ridiculous. I also, when I was at university, I was really interested in doing logic subjects. And so the philosophy department offered subjects in logic and the mathematics department offered subjects in mathematical logic. And I thought, as an early undergraduate, I thought to myself naively, these people, the lecturers and the professors of logic, they must be the clearest thinkers. But in fact, they weren't particularly clear in their thinking at all. There was nothing about their being expert in logic that made them better thinkers than other people. In fact, often it was quite the opposite. And I found that philosophy professors in particular were singularly misguided in trying to think about areas like politics, for example, and morality. We've got Sam, and we both know the great Sam Kuipers, physicist and a colleague of David Deutsch, much like yourself. And he has several questions. Let's go one at a time. So Sam's first question is, one, what is your favorite branch of mathematics if you have one, and why do you consider it important?
The question is, what is my favorite branch of mathematics if I have one, and why I consider it important? So mathematics, pure mathematics, we could say as, I think, five main branches: foundation of mathematics, analysis, topology, algebra, and I think I would place discrete mathematics and combinatoric as a fifth branch. Some people might disagree. They might add the geometry or other branches. And my two favorite branches are foundations of mathematics and algebra. Why are they important? Algebra is something that is useful for a wide amount of different structure, and it gives you a way to study theories. In some sense, what I like is that both study very general theories, including some theories of physics, some theories about even the theory of computation. You can view it as an algebraical theory. In foundation of mathematics, is something that if you're a person that always want to ask the question, why do things work like that, and you keep going in that path, you end up at foundation of mathematics. So if you're interested in the deep reasons or the nature of mathematics itself, then you end up at foundation of mathematics. And if you're interested in theories and the relationship between theories, you end up at algebra. But of course, the other branch are interesting in their own right. They're just less of my interest.
And Sam's second question is, how did you become interested in quantum theory?
Okay, I think I've said it a bit before, but I don't mind saying it again. The reason I'm into quantum theory is strangely because I wanted to understand the nature of mathematics. That's an answer that is almost never heard, because the way is a bit far from pure mathematics to wanting to understand the foundation of mathematics, to realize that the foundation of mathematics depends on symbol manipulation, and that a proof is a computational thing. But then you realize that the computational proof is a physical object. So it's my very far way of trying to understand the nature of mathematics. That's why I was into quantum theory, and to understand how reality itself influences our understanding of mathematics. That doesn't mean it's my sole interest at the moment, but that's how it got me started. Of course, then I realized that as a person very deep into the foundation of mathematics and algebra, I realized that there was a dearth of these ideas in foundation of mathematics. So in foundations of quantum theory. And for me, that became very interesting, because I like to work on foundational and algebraical issues in a field. And I see a field that it really needs it, and where I feel I can make a contribution. So for me, that was very interesting. The possibility to do something that in math would have been done a century ago, and to be part of these very ideas that I found interesting in mathematics that are 100 years old, but to apply them to physics is something I really enjoy.
And just by the way, was it your professor Gilles Brizard who introduced you to the work of David Deutsch, or did you find that independently?
Oh, okay. So at some point, he did mention who David was, but at some point I invented an idea, and it's a little poster I placed on the top of my Twitter feed. And at that point, I didn't know much about who David was, but we did some research and realized, oh, David had done the same thing for quantum theory, and got into, I wrote him an email, and and then we had a conversation over Skype, and it was really nice. And I want to say one thing about my first conversation with David, because we talked first about quantum theory and about locality in quantum theory. It was great fun. But at the end, I had looked on Wikipedia a bit about who he was, because I'm not a physicist. So for me, David was a completely new person. I know names more in mathematics than physics. And I had just seen, oh, this guy has written a book and he has funded. And I noticed, oh, he's not paid by the university. How is he living? And he's just telling me that he's doing things for fun. And I thought that was amazing. That's what I want to do too. I don't really care about other stuff. And he told me it was an ideal to aspire to. And now I'm there. I've accomplished the ideal that I discussed with David in my first conversation with him.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's interesting how we have, to some extent, lost the culture. It is a culture that used to exist a long time ago for academics and scientists, mathematicians. They used to do it for fun, and then it became a sort of career idea. But I'll move on to Sam's third question. And he asks, what do you consider the most impactful use of mathematics in physics? That is, how does better, more rigorous mathematics help us do physics better?
There's two reasons I can think of, and one is that if you have a very wide understanding of mathematics, you can start to see patterns in physics and to see the deep nature of some of the problems. Often, I find a lot of papers in physics or in foundation of physics are very surface level. They don't really show any kind of deep ideas. They don't really try to attack the problem in the deepest way possible, which is how you're taught to attack it in mathematics. At least if you do mathematics well, what you always have to do is to try to find ideas in their most general form, try to find always the deepest argument for why something is true or not. I and the other thing I think it could bring is rigor. Right now, it's sorely lacking, and I find a lot of papers have very basic errors, and the papers don't even hold. And because no one cares about looking whether the arguments work or precise enough, we have a lot of slop where nothing works, no one cares, and as long as the peer reviewers neither know how to find errors, there's this accumulation of mistakes. And the last part about the lack of rigor, I think it is possible to achieve rigor without as much math as I do know. I don't think you need as much. You would just need a slightly more amount. And I also think that some thinkers that themselves claim to be not that technical have achieved rigor. David is an example of that, of someone who has claimed not to have rigorous knowledge of mathematics, but has very rigorous arguments where often they are better than what I would have expected for certain. I'm very impressed by the quality of the arguments.
Our next question is from Nivi, and Nivi is the co-founder of AngelList along with Naval Ravikant. And Nivi's question is, do you have any extensions, improvements, criticisms of David Deutsch's theories of mathematics?
I have had some light disagreements sometime with him, but we've often been able to resolve them because I think we both value the truth and we just want to understand ideas. And but they've never been huge. It was always very technical points. But if I have something to bring that David didn't bring into quantum foundation, it's that I think what I brought was an attempt to formalize completely some notions. So the improvement I have is more regarding the foundation of physics, where I think what rather than in mathematics, where I think my interest was to formalize everything because we can derive very precise consequence and apply mathematical methods to issues that were previously philosophical. One of the things I'd like to develop soon is the idea that the interpretation can be formalized, and once something can be formalized, we can do mathematics on it. And I'd like to be able to prove both the consistency of the many world, not just as an argument, but as a mathematical statement, and the inconsistency of the other interpretations, again, not as an interpretation, not just as a story, but as precise mathematical construct. Because they all make statements, then these statements can be translated into logical statements, and they're amenable to mathematical methods. So I think I have a different angle. So I would not say it's a criticism. I would say it's more of an improvement, because all new knowledge is improvement, and because all new knowledge is improvement, and we need an infinite amount of them, no thinker, no matter how interesting like David, will be without improvement.
Excellent. Anders has asked a couple of questions that I think we may have covered already. We'll ignore the first question because I think that we've covered where your interest in mathematics came from. But number two, we talked about spaced repetition, but are you aware of the fun criterion and how spaced repetition might have anything to do with that?
Of course, it's related to the two components I gave you on how to learn anything. And the first one is freedom. And freedom and fun are the same thing. When you're not coerced, the reason you do things generally is because they're fun. And I think that's a problem with a lot of space repetitions today. They're used to pass exams, and many people find a space repetition very dreadful. That's because they use space repetition coercively. So space repetition has really two ways of being used. One is to pass exams, and then you have to cram stuff, put stuff you don't care about, and it's really, many people told me how disgusted they are with space repetition that they have to use at school because they need it as a tool to pass exams, and it become an engine of torture. And of course, I utterly reject how such a use of space repetition. I think It's something I use to put the ideas that I like the most and I want to remember. And I only put ideas I want to put in there. And anytime I do anything for learning, my criterion is it should be fun. And I will refuse to do mathematics if I find anything more interesting than mathematics at any given moment. If I find a video game more interesting, or writing a story for my own entertainment purpose, or even chatting with people, I will take that over mathematics. And it's a testament to the beauty of mathematics that quite often I end up doing mathematics.
And we have also talked about this, but maybe there is a crossover you can talk to about Anders' third question, which is what stoicism can add to critical rationalism.
I think both theories, both are very close. And where I think the Stoic shine is related to ideas of acceptance and virtue and connecting them to physics and epistemology. I think in the beginning of Infinity, there's not much material on that. It's more interested in other issues like the nature of what is knowledge, or and what Stoicism can teach is the acceptance of external events and a lot of techniques. I've said previously that the techniques without the theory and the physics and the epistemology of Stoicism don't make any sense. But of course, our understanding of both physics and epistemology will keep improving, and that might lead to even better techniques. So I can view how together both critical rationalism, both our understanding of modern physics, of modern epistemology, and ancient Stoic wisdom can be put together to try to understand better the nature of these arguments related to acceptance, or related to the techniques used by the Stoics. As long as you have two set of ideas where you can solve the few contradictions, if they don't have many contradictions, which I believe is the case in Stoicism and critical rationalism, if you can solve them, you end up with a larger theory, and you can use tools from both of them. If there were intractable differences, then you would have a problem. And as I said earlier, one of the problems of the early Stoicism was that they would believe the universe was purposeful, but it's something that you can vary and change a little bit to end up with two theories, critical rationalism and Stoicism, where you just remove that bad ideas, because all the other ideas in Stoic physics find are almost perhaps less refined, but all super close to the ideas of critical rationalism.
Yeah, and the ideas of critical rationalism, to my mind, are really about what Karl Popper laid out. And Popper was talking very much about epistemology, and epistemology that applies to science and politics and that kind of thing. I think what David Deutsch adds is the thing that he holds aloft as the great dichotomy: problems are inevitable, problems are soluble. If there's not a law of physics that stands in the way, then the thing can be accomplished given the right knowledge. And this is true in science and technology as a civilization, but it's also true for the individual as well. And this is an echo of ancient wisdom. The Buddhists and the Stoicists had a similar kind of idea that you must accept the inevitability of the problem and not become frustrated by it, because there will be a solution. But I don't call that critical rationalism. I think that's an addition over and above that David Deutsch has added on to the work of Popper, that I don't think that you get out of Karl Popper, or what is normally called critical rationalism. Maybe some people want to call it critical rationalism, but I think it's actually it's something more than critical rationalism.
I agree that some things are additions, some things are not really in the same name, but in the end, what we should strive for is not exactly name, but you have a set of ideas, and as long as they solve problems and they don't contradict, and they help you to solve problems, and they're your best theories, it doesn't matter what their name is or who they came from. And of course, I agree that the epistemology of Popper is better than the epistemology of the Stoic, but you find some of the best, some great ideas. The Stoic said clearly that all your mental anguish and distress, it all comes from bad ideas. And why do you have, or lack of knowledge, or a certain kind of ignorance of what is truly good and truly harmful? And the way to correct that ignorance is with knowledge. And they say that all vicious actions, all bad actions, stem from ignorance. They're not because you're fundamentally a bad person. It's because you have bad ideas. What is bad is the bad ideas, not the person's herself or himself. Of course, it's not exactly Popper. It's not exactly critical rationalism, but it is in the same mold for sure.
Now, next question is from Guillem Plow, and I'm not sure what this means, but we will try anyway. I'll just ask you, can we define purely mathematically the forgetting process?
The answer is no. Mathematics cannot do kind of things. It cannot do anything related to that depend on knowledge of the real world, biology, or it cannot answer questions about the nature of physics in itself. Of course, there's mathematical formula on the forgetting process, but can I define pure or can I derive from pure mathematics the process of forgetfulness? And the answer is no. It's not a purely mathematical question. And mathematics doesn't tell you what is the the right theory about the world. So all mathematics does is if of the theory. And beyond that, mathematics cannot do much on its own.
Let us try to go to the next question and see how we go. From Erik, in what ways can mathematics be considered a language and in what ways not?
Mathematics can be considered a formal language. And in linguistics, you have all the characteristics of a language, like you have semantics, syntax, grammar. However, it's not a world language that we could use to communicate as I'm doing right now with you, because in mathematics, often mean words are not interpreted to have reference to something in the real world. As soon as become about the real world, you're no longer doing mathematics, you're doing physics, or you're doing biology, or you're having a discussion about the weather, something like that. So it's a language, the formal sense, in the sense that you will have the same characteristic through semantic trees or syntactical trees. You have semantic, you have a you have all the characteristic. You have symbols. You have symbols that you combine to form. You would call them expressions, and you have propositions. Proposition would be the analog to sentences. However, the main difference is that it doesn't refer about the real world, and thus it's not it's not possible to communicate with mathematics outside of when we're discussing mathematics itself or things that have been given interpretation.
Yes. Josh has asked, what you think of Imre Lakatos and his idea of a research program?
No idea.
Probably for the best. Imre Lakatos tried to walk a line between Kuhn and Popper, and he didn't do it very successfully, so we can leave that there. Hemant has asked, what do you think is the biggest misconception humans have about the nature of mathematics itself?
I'm not sure. Of course, I do hear a lot of nonsense regarding Gödel's theorem, but David does talk about the mathematician misconceptions, where some people do not realize that proofs are a physical process. But honestly, I don't see a lot of misconception in thinking about it. I don't see a lot of misconception in mathematics because it's a field that is remarkably able to correct errors. That's a thing where or formalized language or ability to even have formal theories on formalized mathematics. So we have mathematical theories on mathematics that are remarkably precise and rigorous, and it has eliminated a lot of mistakes that still plague physics, other theories that are less precise. For many things, I find mathematics to be in healthier shape than other academic disciplines in terms of the quality of the arguments and the logic. It's not perfect, but I think there are remarkably few compared to many other fields.
I think that in the general public, the most common misconception is a confusion between the subject area and the knowledge of the subject area, especially when it comes to mathematics. People confuse the process that you go through in mathematics class or mathematics lesson or doing a proof with the fact that you can get certain truth. There's certain truth or necessary truth. It's a subject matter, but that doesn't mean that's what you get. But I think it is still what many people think of mathematics, that mathematics is the one place where you get absolutely certain truth.
I think that's a great idea, Brett, that you're correct. Now I agree with you. The biggest misconception of mathematics is that it gives you certain truth. And it doesn't, because it rests on axioms. And as we discussed earlier, all these axioms are conjecture. And when I started mathematics, that was my goal too. I said, I want to do mathematics. It's beautiful. I like it and all that. But one of my hope is that at least compared to other disciplines where they keep having revolutions, mathematics would be additive in nature. It would be knowledge that is certain forever. And of course, at some point, that's not how it works, but that's not too bad.
It's far more interesting to know that things can be improved. Yes. Samu has asked, what is the most influential problem solution pair in mathematics and why?
I think it's an error to think that there's one problem in mathematics that is so important, but if I had to give one thing in mathematics that is the most important of all, it has to be the development of unary numerals about maybe 30,000 years ago by the probably shepherd that existed. And I think that represents the first mathematical theory. And it's a theory that is still used today, that now we have formalized that theory. It gave birth to the natural numbers that gave birth to fractions eventually and to everything. So I'll start with just someone who had the idea that you could count his sheep and realize probably he did not even have name for these. You don't need names. You just need to establish a bijective correspondence between his animal and the trait on his bone. And to me, that theory alone is one I still find fascinating today. Of course, we have a lot more theorems about that theory of the natural numbers and a lot more theories on unary numerals. But that problem is the most foundational. It's the starting point of everything. It led later to when agriculture started to the development of addition, multiplication, because the numbers they were dealing with were too high to deal with just the tally stick on the bone, which eventually led to more and more problems. But that's the first one. So that's the greatest and most important one.
Yeah, it's the understand, maybe not the explicit understanding, but it's the use of abstractions. It's noticing out there in the world, here's one sheep, here is one apple, here is one tree, here is one person. And from that, you abstract out this one. And so you can then use that as a symbol. So then you have the symbol for one and two and so on and so forth. So yeah, I agree with you. That's a very groundbreaking thing for human civilization. Aziz has asked, what do you think about category theory?
That's a good question. And I do use category theory. So I'll start by explaining a bit what category theory is. So in math, you have a lot of theories. You have the theory of group, the theory of ring, the theory of topological space. You have the theory of real numbers, the theory of vector space, Banach spaces, Hilbert space. So you have many theory. And category theory says, let's view the theory of group as a category. The object of the theory of group will be all the groups. And then there's transformation between groups, and these are the morphism. So you have a set of object and a set of transformation for group. There's a category of group, a category of rings, a category of topological space. And now category theory decide these are our object. Now the object of my theory are these theories. So it study not one particular things, but it study theories and relationship between theories. In the same way that a mathematical theory would study object and relation between the objects, now we study theories and relationship between the theories. And it's something that allow you to generalize arguments that occur in a lot of areas of mathematics, because it allow you to talk about any kind of abstract relationship between two theories of mathematics, or even inside these theories. Often you have arguments that depend only on the super abstract feature. Of course, sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes you need to go inside the theory that you're dealing with, but sometimes you don't need to. And that's where category theory shines. It doesn't shine with the details that are very specific, but it shines with these super abstractions. And that's a bit why you asked earlier, is there a theory which is so much more important than do everything? The answer is no, because when you deal with generalization, you cannot deal with everything. You cannot deal with the little details. And I use category theories, and it's related a bit to my usage of space repetition, because I don't like to repeat arguments. I like to have arguments that are extremely general that I can reuse in all kind of proof. And because of that, category theory has been instrumental to this. I like the fact that I can have arguments for some theorems, not always, and they quite often you don't use categorical arguments, but when they can be used, do use them.
Ariya has asked, except for the fundamentals of mathematics, which you have recommended before, what are your favorite papers and books on physics and mathematics?
That's a tough question, because I rarely make very specific recommendation, because it often depends on what kind of very specific questions you are into. These are the only books that I truly recommend, no matter the interest of the person, because they're very wide in scope and very general. So I do enjoy the Princeton Companion to Pure Mathematics. It's not very technical, but it introduces you to the wide variety of topic, and it's a heavy volume. So if I have to give very general recommendation, I'm not going to give right now a very specific book. As for physics, I'm not a physicist, and I just have to clarify it, because I know I publish in Foundation of Physics, but I'm not. But I did enjoy starting the Feynman lectures on physics. I find it very readable. It's very different from my own approach to that is super rigorous. But if you want to, it's well written. It's interesting. It's quite basic level, I think. But for me, that's that's what I want because I'm not a physicist. I just want something that allow me to maybe have a bird's eye view of physics without super technical things. But I'm less in place to make physics recommendations. I have to say my knowledge of math might be 35 times superior to my knowledge of physics because maybe that's an interesting thing. When I started to do quantum theory, all I needed for the research I did was an understanding of what the axioms of quantum theory is. And for me, that was sufficient to write everything. I just needed the basic rules. Once I knew, okay, these are the basic rules, I'm like, okay, I'll think about this as a mathematician would. I don't need to know super specific theorems of quantum theory for what I was doing. I just needed to know, okay, I know what a Hilbert space is. I know what a unitary transformation is, all these things, what vectors, what is the theory of how we combine system. And once I have the axioms and the basic rules as a mathematician, I can do a lot. I don't need to know what an atom is. I don't need to know many things. So my knowledge of physics is often very close to the axioms, and there's not a lot of them. And then I work at these things as a mathematician would. I have a very limited knowledge of any kind of things in physics, and I've been able to survive without a problem.
Ariya has also asked, and I would put this question a different way, but I'll ask it as it's written there. And the question is, why information helps to understand quantum mechanics?
I would put it in a different way too, in the sense that it's more why quantum theory helps us understand information.
Yes.
It's not why information, that's how you would have put it too. And the reason is that physics leads to theories about computing because computing and information are physical things. And quantum theory is the theory among the theories of physics that tell you how computation and information work. And the reason of why is because it's the theory that tell you what kind of operation you can do on systems and what are the input and output in these systems. And when I formulate this super abstractly, you realize, oh, that's what computation is about. That's a theory where you put input in system, you do operation on them, and that you get output. And that's the important lesson. So before quantum theory, the theory of computation was a very mathematical theory, a theory that said this is what a computer can do. And it turned out to be incorrect. It turned out that the theory of information by Shannon and the theory of computing by Turing where what you obtain when you have quantum theory, but you don't have fine control over quantum systems. When you're not allowed to do all the operation, you're only allowed to do some of the operations, these systems, you get classical computing and classical information theory. But these were the wrong theories. And the reason they were the wrong theories is because of quantum theory that say, no, if you have finer control over these systems and if you can do more stuff.
Yes, and this also harks back to John Archibald Wheeler's paper, It from Bit, where he wanted to argue, as many people do, that the fundamental nature of reality is information, and the information is some sort of abstract thing. And David Deutsch wrote the response, It from Qubit, where he argues, or explains, I should say, that the fundamental nature of reality is material, it is matter, and therefore information. The fundamental unit of information is the qubit, which is more complicated than the bit in some sense and more simple in another sense. But the fact is that information itself must be physical because it has to be represented in some way using, in the most fundamental understanding we have of what information and computing is, quantum computing, the qubit is the fundamental part of information and the qubit is a physical thing. Cory has asked, what is the connection between, this follows on from the last question, what is the connection between entropy in information theory and entropy in thermodynamics?
As I said previously, I'm not a physicist. That's not the theory I know. I think many people are in better position to answer that specific question.
Yeah, I'll say to Cory, and this is plugging my own channel here. If you go to my other channel, apart from this one, on Talkcast, and there's a number of episodes there where I do actually talk about this kind of thing. And in particular, there's a couple of episodes there on it from qubit and information and that kind of thing. Yes, it's a whole area.
The topic would interest me. It's just that I don't feel like I'm an expert on that. I prefer to let better people.
Josh has asked, how does he approach criticizing explanations or parts of them mathematically?
Sometimes you can do it in the sense that some explanations have mathematical content or content translatable in mathematics. Every sentence can be formalized and can be put into a theory because all I'm just stating is that there's the sentence contain object and the relation between the object, and then once it's done, you can derive consequences using the rules of mathematics and logic to find out what are the consequences of your ideas, and then you can find contradiction. But it's not going to do everything. Mathematics doesn't tell you whether your theory is correct, as I said earlier. It only tell you it can tell you if your theory is incorrect if you manage to derive a contradiction. It's good for eliminating errors in explanations as long as the explanations are at least sufficiently clear and lucid that you can translate them into mathematical language. And that's the case for many theory interpretations of quantum theory, where they're making statements that are very close to the mathematics and that are often incorrect. But I don't consider math to be universal in regard to finding or understanding explanations. We need a lot of non-mathematical arguments or explanations. It's one tool among many, but I think it's a tool that has been seriously underused in foundation of physics.
Very good. Just two questions left. The first one is from Hemant, and he says, what role do you think pure mathematics and abstract reasoning play in solving complex real-world problems like AI alignment or the control of advanced technologies?
So I think the role of mathematics to solve real-world problems and AI alignment has been really overstated. These problems, mathematics is only good if your theory is correct, and often the problem is determining whether your theory is correct or not. And the issue for AI alignment or many real-world problems is not philosophical, it's not mathematical, it's philosophical. Question is not, do we have a theory of AI alignment that is super good and then we can derive its consequence? No, what I see when people use math to solve these problems, they use a theory that is very dubious, full of numbers that are made up. And the goal is to make it sound very precise and say, oh, we've computed the probability of AI do to be 75%. So the big problem that I see is not that it's that mathematics is overused for theories that are philosophically bankrupt. And I strongly condemn this. Like I've seen papers that have super precise mathematical figures on the amount of chicken that should be killed versus killing a human, and they just use very spurious assumption like the number of neurons, and just because the number of neurons in both sides is the same and you can write math about it, that doesn't mean what you did is philosophically coherent, and that's the biggest problem. Just because I'm a mathematician doesn't mean I think it's useful or solves everything. There's a place for non-maths, and the thing that's needed for many of these issues is good philosophy, not more and more complex mathematical models.
Yeah, I've often thought that the word mathematism should enter the vernacular, although I don't like made up words, but people try to sometimes invoke the word scientism when they're talking about the incorrect application of, let's say, science to morality. People like certain philosophers will say, if we could MRI scan people's brains and figure out what is the most pleasurable state, this would tell you what the most moral thing to do would be. Now, in a similar way, you do get philosophers of a certain kind saying things like, my probability of P doom, for example, with the AI is 75%. But then you ask them, oh, how did you come up with the number? And they say, oh, I don't really mean 75% after all. It's just an approximation to give you an indication of how scared I am. And it's like, why did you even need a number at all in the first place? Just say you're scared. It doesn't matter what the number is. So you're right. It's an attempt to try and make things sound precise that are actually not precise. And we have a last question. No, I'm not going to pronounce the person's name because I can't, but he's asking about a viral clip, a short that went around of a physics professor, and he wonders if you've seen it. I'll just describe it for the audience. And it is a spin on that. And in fact, the professor mentions Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman famously said, if you think you understand quantum theory, you don't understand quantum theory. And this professor does quite a funny take on it. It's still nonsense, but he does this funny take where he says, I don't understand quantum theory. No one understands quantum theory. And you, my students, in a couple of weeks should also come to a point where you too do not understand quantum theory. And then you have passed the course kind of thing. What do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts on this idea that no one understands quantum theory?
The question about the professor who says that it bothers me that someone say that we cannot The attitude I get from this is that we cannot understand quantum theory and that we should just be puzzled and in awe of it. And I think any theory that can be put in math, which is the case for quantum theory, and put precisely in mathematics, can be understood and can be interpreted. And whenever there's a problem in your understanding, to just give up and say, oh, it cannot be understood, or we should just resign ourselves to do mathematics on it, that's an attitude that is inimical to progress. Progress depends on understanding things, and when there's a problem, on not giving up and trying other ideas. If anything, part of the reason why quantum theory is not understood is because there's a lot of bad philosophy around it, and that thing can be corrected through criticism and debate. And we're at an era where we have a very good understanding of quantum theory. We have an interpretation, the many world interpretation, which makes perfect sense and on which it's possible to make progress. It solves the problems that plagued people like Richard Feynman for the double slit experiments, for instance. That's something that we now today understand perfectly. There will always be things we don't understand. But the idea that we should just give up and resign ourselves and just say, oh, I don't understand it, not understanding something is a fundamental state of being human, because there's an infinite amount of problems that we don't understand and we'll need to solve because our knowledge is finite, but in the problems we have potentially infinite in scope. That's not the right attitude. Would be to say to the students, I don't understand some stuff, and together we'll try to understand it. We'll try to make sense of it. And anytime there's a problem or understanding, we'll see it as an opportunity for learning. It's okay to say I don't understand stuff. There's stuff I don't understand about quantum theory that still puzzle me, but I see every questions as eventually being answerable. Perhaps not by me, perhaps not in our lifetime or generation, but that's normal. There's plenty of process we don't understand. I don't think consciousness has a perfect theory yet, but that's okay.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining me, Paul. We've covered a lot of ground. And thanks to the Conjecture Institute for the ongoing support of this podcast and for all of your work. Is there any final remarks you'd like to make before we close this out?
Yes, I want to say a very big thank you to you for having done the podcast and for your patience with my computer issues. You were a gracious host, and I also want to thank you for everything.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Yeah, that's wonderful to hear.